Hello, everyone. My name is Azaria Mosby. I'm a first year architecture major from Petersburg, Virginia at Hampton University. Recently, I conducted a research project exploring the conflict between African Americans and Africans. Specifically, I looked at the misconceptions taught in both communities and the historical context behind the conflict. I also asked a few questions to a couple of friends so they can give their opinion on the whole situation. So, without further ado, let's get into it.
I wouldn't say that I've witnessed much conflict between the two groups, but I've definitely experienced it a lot when I was younger, especially in elementary school, being told to go back to Africa or being called an African booty scratcher, or sometimes even being told we can't talk to Africans, things like that. And I know a lot of it may sound a little bit unrealistic, but it did happen. But for the most part, I don't really dwell on it or really think of it as a big deal because we were kids back then and kids didn't really understand what they were saying. But it is a little bit unsettling because you do have to wonder what their parents are saying at home because children are a product of their environment.
So, regarding question one, I've personally never witnessed or experienced really a conflict with African Americans. Well, since I'm African, I've never experienced a conflict with them, and I've never really witnessed one. I've really grew up in an environment where there wasn't really much of a problem between the African American and African communities.
Time where I witnessed conflicts between African Americans and Africans is when my friend was telling me about her strict family beliefs when it comes to cooking. It was very different from my household. We didn't have to know how to do all of this.
I mean, the only real time I see conflicts between African Americans and Africans, at least in my experience, is like on social media. People just be making jokes, but I mean, there's kind of social media jokes. I wouldn't say they don't have like an effect, but they're not as like impactful as like real life things.
Yes, I do believe it's possible for African Americans to appropriate African culture, especially if what they're appropriating requires an initiation process in African culture or requires you be of a certain level in society. So for example, I'm Nigerian, specifically Igbo, and they have this title where a man has to kill a cow, and that basically like raises his status in society, and because of that he gets a special red hat he wears. So I think that if an African American wears that, I think it will draw a lot of offense from that community. But for the most part, wearing dashikis or waistbands or regular things like that, it's not offensive at all, and it's not really appropriating because a lot of African Americans want to connect back to their African roots and their heritage, and it's really not that big of a deal if you wear dashikis, African shoes, African pants, things like that. Listen to African music, it's not a big deal. Vice versa, I do believe it's possible for African Americans to appropriate African American culture. I think it goes a little bit unnoticed in today's society because of the fact that Africans are black. And so if a white person came up to me, he wouldn't even notice that I'm African. He'd just think of me as an African American. And I think that's generally how most of society views Africans in a way. So yeah, and I think because African American culture is really just popular culture, everything from R&B to hip hop to the way they speak to the way they dress, I think that it's being appropriated by everyone. And because of the fact that it's popular culture, it's going unnoticed. So yeah, I do believe both African Americans and Africans can appropriate each other's culture.
I do believe an African American can appropriate African culture. I don't define appropriating as like essentially taking on a culture that isn't yours. I define it as taking on a culture that you have disrespected. For example, if a person is wearing African clothing, but they genuinely appreciate it, I don't see that as appropriating. I think that think of that as celebrating African culture and African clothes. While if a person who disrespects African clothing, calls it ugly or something, but is then seen rocking African clothing or African clothing patterns and colors and stuff like that, I would see that as appropriation.
I don't believe it's possible for African Americans to appropriate African culture unless they are abusing it somehow. Example, we could wear dashikis and stuff, but we can't call it our own stuff. How white people can wear box braids, or they're not supposed to, whatever, but they can't call it boxer braids.
I mean, kind of. I'm kind of like bridge the gap between both, I guess, because I more have an Americanized view on things, but my parents are like pure African. So like, I don't know if I could say it's like appropriation in a way, because it's like it's also the same African culture, just in two different versions of it, I guess. So I wouldn't say they could really appropriate it, but there's definitely like some malintent in some things I say.
For the second question on, do you believe it's possible for African Americans to appropriate African culture? Example, dashikis or waist beads, etc. I don't actually think that they can. I think because it is technically our culture that you can't appropriate what's yours. Obviously, like there are things that are distinctively African American, things that are distinctively African due to the culture of whether or not you actually were sold in the transatlantic slave trade or not. But I mean, like for me, my religion is an African religion. It's called Lukumi. It's derived from Ifa, which comes from the Yoruba people in West Africa. And so for me, when I wear things like my ilekes or like beads that I wear, or when I wear, or when I have, certain, pieces of cloth or things in my bag, or when I have just 3 coins and I put 3 pennies at the end of a crosswalk, just because of, something for me, that's not appropriating. That's just a part of my culture because that is like who we are. So I don't necessarily believe that. I think in terms of vice versa, when it comes to Africans appropriating African American culture, I think that's when I kind of see a discrepancy in terms of double standards, because I feel like there are certain things that are distinctively African American. I mean, considering we were, sold as cattle. Or worse than cattle. We were in the bottom of the slave boat, all piled up like sardines and given no air, no water, no food, no drink, no nothing. And so I think that there are certain things that come with that, with a just a conjoined sense of culture that all black people have in America, which I think is pretty amazing. But because you go to things like HBCUs and you see a bunch of different people there that all have similar experiences. But if you never experienced American culture, then you can't experience African American culture if you're African. There's a whole hyphen in there. And so I think because they're the ones that we have descended from, I think that's why there's the whole us doing stuff that they do is not appropriation, but them doing stuff that we do can be. But yeah.
Yes, I do think that both communities have anti-black beliefs and internalized racism. I'm gonna start with the Africans. I do think that some Africans look down on African Americans, and I do think that some Africans do view African Americans as criminals. And that's something I definitely don't agree with or support at all. For example, my mom knows somebody who's African who has a child that keeps on getting in trouble with the law, and they keep on having to go to court, but they keep losing their court cases. And the African is blaming the fact that they're losing their court cases on the fact that their lawyer is African American. So I think that's an example of just pure blatant racism in the African community towards Africans. But of course, it's some Africans, it's not most Africans or all Africans. And in terms of internalized racism on the African American side, I think that colorism is a huge problem in the African American community. And I think a lot of that comes from just historical beauty standards. Light skin has always been seen as the most desired and favorable skin. So I think that a lot of the internalized racism in the African American community comes from colorism. I also want to add that a lot of internalized racism, in my opinion, in both the African and African American communities also comes from, and this is just purely my opinion, Christianity. For example, many Africans kind of look down on their traditional religions and kind of think of their traditional religions as demonic, when that's truly just not the case. A lot of them were indoctrinated into thinking that because of the fact that Christianity was brought over, at least to the part of Africa where I'm from, Christianity was brought over by white people. And they told them that, their traditional religions and the way they organized their societies was demonic and just not right. And a lot of Africans still hold that, those views today that their traditional religions are demonic.
I do think there's internalized racism between both communities. In some cases, it's really just ignorance of people failing to educate themselves. And I think a lot of it has to do with the media portrayal of both communities. Africa is generally portrayed as poor. There's no water, no electricity, when that really isn't the case for most Africans. And African Americans are generally portrayed as very violent. I've seen examples of people really believing these stereotypes and having that affect their view and their behavior towards one of those communities.
African Americans definitely have internalized racism when it comes to Africans, because they were portrayed as poor and they have like no water and stuff like that. And Africans definitely think of African American as thugs. Hence why they don't even want their sons to have dreads or wear do-rags and all that. And they basically just think of us as ghetto. They also call all African Americans lazy, when we literally didn't get a chance to have jobs and all that. But they call us lazy for not having jobs, and we're not even allowed to have certain jobs.
In saying, does each community have internalized anti-black beliefs? I mean, I think there's like anti-black beliefs in any group, black or not black, but I think definitely, at least in my experience, I've seen like a lot of positive pro-black things in both groups. And I would say, I mean, I don't know. I don't think either group necessarily has like an inherent internalized anti-black belief in either side. I think they're all just pro-black, just in different ways.
Do you think either community has internalized racism or anti-black beliefs, and what are they? I would definitely say that there is that. Whether or not it's like, unconscious, like underlying things that, just have happened in our culture. I mean, with the hyper masculinization of, black men and black women, I don't know if this is a word, but I'm gonna make it a word, like the ratchetization of black women. You know what I mean? Like all of that stuff in terms of like making it seem like, if you're wearing a bonnet or if you're wearing a head wrap, you what's the word? My bad. Sorry, but you are ratchet. You know what I'm saying? When it's like, no, bro, like I'm just getting my mail. Like, chill out on me, And so certain things like that, where it just comes from, years and years of it being ingrained in our DNA. Like it's kind of hard to, because it's not something that you can like consciously internalize. I mean, it kind of goes back to like, the term MF, right? Like the cuss word MF. That derives from like, there were people who were they would, during the slave trade, or not the slave trade, but during slavery, they would take men and they would force them to breed with other people. And, because they didn't care and they didn't see us as people, sometimes you would have to breed with your mother. So, stuff like that, where it's like just regular average, quote like slang words that are derived from our pain and our suffering. It's, it's kind of hard not to internalize, the racism and the anti-black beliefs. It really is. I mean, thinking about like whether or not you're ever since I was a kid, like I was always told, oh, you're light skinned, you know what I'm saying? And it's like, okay, like why do I have to be light skinned? Can't I just be black? That's just what it is, you know? But it's also on the same hand, like I know people who get called burnt, you know what I mean? Like, and it's stuff like that where it's like, you know what I'm saying? It's like, now, if you really knew how that would make somebody feel, I doubt that you would be saying it. But it's something that's so far ingrained in our culture that it just is. You know what I mean? And at this point, it's just up to us to kind of break these generational curses. And that's really kind of what I believe.
Who the fuck is this nigga? Move wrong and we dustin' this nigga? Just wait up 100-pack nigga?
So West Africans, after calling African Americans runaway cats, to make fun of the fact that they were enslaved. I've never heard of that in my life. I don't think that's okay to say, but I've never heard of anybody say that in my life.
Regarding the TikTok, I've never heard the term runaway cats. I've never heard Africans refer to African Americans as any, I want to say derogatory word or phrase or something like that. But yeah, it almost makes me want to think this person kind of made it up to spark a divide or just get famous or clout out of it. But then again, this is from my experience, so they could have seen it happen. They could have experienced it. So yeah.
The first one is true in my opinion. They get mad at us for not knowing our culture, yet we were taken and we had it stripped away from us.
Pertaining to the last post, I do understand a lot of the things that he's saying, and I do agree with some of it, especially the Black Panther example where, all of a sudden Black Panther came out and a lot of African Americans started embracing the African roots. For me, it was just a little bit confusing because I just didn't understand how a movie could do that. Especially when, years prior, you're made fun of for being African. But yeah, other than that, the Mudhug jokes, the colors jokes, the jokes about poor African countries, yeah, I've definitely heard that, but I heard that when I was like really, really young, like in elementary school. More recently, I haven't heard anything like that coming from African Americans. I haven't experienced any racism for African Americans recently. So I will say that in my personal experience, things are getting better.
Regarding the last question about middle school and high school, again, my middle school and high school experience was like really accepting. I grew up around Black people, but they never made any kind of really offensive remark. Yeah, we joked here and there about certain things, but never to the point where I felt offended or felt as though they were disrespecting me or my culture. I do think it does exist. Too many people have experienced it and have publicly talked about it for me to think it's something that just doesn't exist. I know my sister experienced it as well in her high school. So it definitely is a problem, but I think it's a problem that is slowly going away, especially considering that African culture is being embraced more and more throughout the last few years.
The second one is also true. I'm not going to sit here and lie. I grew up thinking negatively of them, but that's because they were portrayed negatively in media.
So I think in reference of the two additional pieces with the TikTok video talking about the West Africans calling African Americans runaway cats, and then the other one where it was talking about how African American students treating African students in like middle and high school. I think it's one of those things where it's like we both got pinned against each other when we are the same person. And I think it's kind of funny because I think like no matter where you go in the world, there's always like anti-Black rhetoric. It's always there. I mean, you think about when you go to Dominican Republic, and there are people that are like blacker than black. You know what I'm saying? And And they, what's it called? They're the same people who are like, oh, no soy negra, no soy negro, you know what I'm saying? And it's like, bro, like you are literally the darkest person I've ever seen in my life. How are you going to tell me that you're not black? And so it goes back to one of those things where it's just like, it's internalized. And so I think it's funny how like, we have sites like on TikTok where people, or like this TikTok where it's like, oh, you know, Africans are bullying African Americans. And then we have like, you know, this person's like real life story about like their experience in high school and middle school. And it's African Americans are bullying Africans. And it's just like we're kind of stuck in this stalemate to where like, it's almost like I don't want to say it's like a size up competition, but it kind of is. Like who's the bigger loser in this situation, you know? Are the Africans bullying African Americans? Are the African Americans bullying Africans? And at this point, it's just dumb. It's the teapot calling the kettle black, except for it's the African calling the African American black. It just doesn't make sense. But like I said with the other thing, it's just the world that we live in, and it's really just up to us to kind of break down these barriers that are ingrained in our DNA from the hundreds of years of slavery and unfair treatment. I mean, shoot, we're still not even at it, you know. But I definitely think that like when it comes to stuff like this, like it just kind of has to be a cold turkey, like, bruh, just chill, just stop with it, you know. We're all the same person, and we just got pinned against each other for one reason or the other, you know. And I think it's also hard when African American culture is what it is, and then you know you have people coming from outside of where, you know, we of our quote unquote motherland coming into our area and making fun of us, you know, and we don't even have it secure here. So I know that you know, while I've never experienced any of these like situations firsthand, I can definitely empathize on both sides to where it's like, you know, oh, you think because you live in America you're better than me, or oh, you think because you're from Africa you're better than me, and it just kind of do like I said, this whole like pinning one against the other for no reason, really. But you know, that's